News out of Europe showing that Credit Suisse getting a bailout after several banks here in the United States getting bailouts. And while they say taxpayers aren't paying for this, if you bank, you're paying fees. And those fees, some of those being paid in assessments to go and fund a fund that's going to cover the deposits of some of these failed banks in the United States, like Silicon Valley Bank, which last week failed and the Fed stepped in. And then you had New York Signature Bank where the Feds had to step in. And then you have a whole host of other banks all across that are essentially being evaluated as to possibly falling the same way that some of these other banks have fallen. And what this ultimately means, especially with the drastic spike. I mean, if you look at some of the charts that the Fed has put out recently of how much they've had to borrow and make liquid so that banks can actually have money to cover if depositors want to take out of those banks, it's spiked. So what all this means for you, the taxpayer, for you, the person who needs to bank, who pays fees to a bank, you're essentially socializing losses of these depositors. You're essentially not, having a true outcome that is of a capitalist nature. If you make bad investments or you deposit with a bad bank, it's one of those things where there's consequences. But the moral hazard that some people argue is, we too often see in the United States a privatization of gains, but then a socialization of losses. And that's the concern a lot of people have. But how does all of this impact pension funds? In Illinois, we talked about this on Friday, about the pension system, how we have $140 billion unfunded liability. That's just for the 5 Illinois public pension funds, the state retirees, the university retirees, the legislature, the judges, and the teachers' retirement system. The teachers' retirement system told me that they don't have any expected losses from the failing SVB, so that apparently is not impacting TRS. But when you look at, for instance, the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund, which is more for the local government officials, and those local government officials are the ones that are non-public safety, like, for instance, not police and fire. IMRF told me that they have a very minor hit from SVB being collapsed, and it was only about $3 million of like a $49 billion portfolio. I also got a message back from the I believe it was the police retirement accounts, the downstate consolidated police retirement account, and they said that they only have about like a $1.9 million hit. I forget the actual number, but that was only of about an 8-point-some-odd billion dollar portfolio. So again, a very, very, sub 1% impact. But that's just from SVB. What if we see kind of a cascade of sorts of all of these other banks? How is that going to be impacting pension funds? Well, state lawmakers late last week, they did hear a variety of different things, but it wasn't necessarily about the banking system's impact. State lawmakers instead heard about different ideas that they're looking to possibly change the state's pension system to make benefits more generous in Tier 2 and so on. I talked with State Representative Stephanie Kifowit briefly, and she laid out some of what they expected to hear during a subject matter hearing last week.
Well, I think this is the purpose of subject matter hearing, is to have the experts come in and present ideas, present proposable solutions. As was presented today, there's some solutions in the Senate that we have to review. And looking at all this expert testimony is the goal of the committee, so that we can look at best practices and sound policy, so that going forward, the state of Illinois can continue its climb to fiscal stability and fiscal responsibility that the individuals in the state of Illinois should be proud of.
Dan Kifowit went on to talk about the trajectory of some of these pieces of legislation and what to expect moving forward.
No, I think what you heard today was several bills along the same subject line. Most likely to be efficient with the process is not to have multiple bills that are similar in nature addressing the same situation, the same project. So we aim in this committee to be efficient and straightforward. So I think, as you heard today, these several bills of very similar nature most likely will become one bill of the general idea, solving that problem within our corrections and our university officer systems, among the others that have testified today.
So that's State Representative Stephanie Kifowit, a Democrat out of Oswego. She's the chairperson of the House Personnel and Pensions Committee at the state of Illinois, acknowledging that something has to happen with pension funds. It's a severe issue. It takes a lot of tax dollars. But coming up, we'll hear from the Republican side of this argument. We already heard a little bit of Stephen Reich last week. I shared with you him worried that what happens with Credit Suisse could lead to a larger international banking crisis. And then over the weekend, we hear, indeed, Credit Suisse has a lot of problems, and it's starting to see a bit of a domino effect of the ongoing concerns of the status of our banking system globally. But there was more to what Stephen Reich had to say when I chatted with him at the State House last week, and it dealt with the need for reforming Illinois' pension system, and in particular, addressing the unfunded liability through some drastic means he says only the U.S. Congress can step in and help with, and that is allowing states to go bankrupt. And he says it's a moral imperative because he says the state's not going to be able to conduct itself and provide for the stability of necessary services if it continues to have to throw nearly a quarter, if not more, of every dollar to the state's pension funds. So we'll hear from State Representative Stephen Reich next here on WMAY. And, of course, you can always chime in live and local at 217-629-7970. That's the phone number here on WMAY. And you can email me, bishoponair@gmail.com. Today's daily poll at WMAY.com asks the question, what should Illinois do with surplus revenue? Tax cuts, pay down pension debt, or bolster the rainy day fund? Most of you saying that you want to see more money going to the pension debt. About 70%. Where's that now? Went ahead and refresh that. We've been tracking this all morning long, and most of you have been saying all morning long, pay down pension debt. That's exactly what we're talking about here in this segment on WMAY.
Listen and watch the interviews with today's newsmakers on Facebook and YouTube. Like and subscribe now. Springfield's Morning News with Greg Bishop on 92.7 WMAY.
Dan, we've been talking about the pensions, the impact the pension system is going to have with the ongoing banking turmoil that you're hearing more and more about, including across the pond with Credit Suisse getting a little bit of a squeeze in the buyout from a collapsing liquidity. And this is something that we're seeing more and more concerns about as the Fed in the United States looks to free up more liquidity by borrowing more. And we're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions, if not tens of billions. I think 150 billion is one figure I saw floated around. And what's going to be happening and how that impacts pension funds, because pension funds are heavily invested in the states. The state's pension funds are heavily invested in various types of investments, and they look to reap profits from that to put back into the pension system. But when you have a pension system like Illinois', where really the main one that's best funded is the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund. They're like 90-some-odd% funded. So they're the most healthy pension fund, probably one of the most healthy pension funds in the country. But when you look at all the other pension funds across the state, poorly funded. Chicago's municipal pension funds, poorly funded. You're talking, 20+% or something like that. You look at some of the 5 statewide pension funds, and all combined, they're only about 45 or so percent funded. $140 billion unfunded pension liability. When actuaries want to see that pension liability only at about 90% funded. Or 100% funded, not 45% funded. We'll take a quick call here, and then we'll hear from what Republican State Representative Stephen Reich told me about the imperative here, why Illinois has to address its pension system, and what drastic steps he says needs to be taken or else. But real quick, a call. Good morning. You're on WMAY.
Yes, so some of these unfunded pensions, what happened to the money that was originally funded to them? And now the Illinois taxpayer is supposed to bail it out again?
Yeah, I mean, listen, the funding mechanisms include some of the employees putting into that, but it's also state dollars, very similar to how an employer in the private sector matches donations, but instead of it being a deferred compensation, it's a defined benefit. So that defined benefit from a pension is going to be defined regardless if the money's there or not. With that 3% compounded annual COLA, that also adds to the increased costs for the Tier 1 pensioners. So what's happened? I think maybe it's a combination of poor market activity from investments to try to gain and build those funds to the higher costs of the benefits to the lack of money being put into the system. So it's a combination of things. But how are things going to be impacted moving forward? State Representative Stephen Reich, he has some suggestions. He wants to make sure that the pension systems are addressed in a timely manner and done so with steps that will actually be, let's say, beneficial and not just nibble around the edges.
And why is that? Just because of all the
because we can't. We put 25% of our general revenue into paying back what we should have been paying in on pensions over the past God knows how many years. That is not going to get any better, no matter what anybody says, with regard to the ramp. It's just not. And I am not convinced that if Congress were to act and amend Article 9 of the Bankruptcy Code to allow for structured bankruptcy of our pension systems, and that's not totally it's not like there's nothing there, but structured bankruptcy like they did in Detroit. And we have the ability to let municipalities do that here in the state. We have the statutory authority to grant them the ability to do that, but we haven't done it. But the fact is that if Article 9 was to be amended, then we could come back and start sitting down with these folks that were here today and say, okay, you got a pretty good deal, especially Tier 1 people. By the time Tier 1 people are out of, have retired, within 5 or 6 years, they're making almost as much, if not more, as what they were making when they were working. That's not what pensions are meant to do. So if what we can do is get Congress to say, there is a problem here, it must be resolved, I think it would withstand a contracts clause challenge in the Supreme Court, because there are certain things that are more important to the constitutional makeup of this country, to the federalist makeup of this country, and that is the police powers of the state and their ability to manage their own affairs. And when it comes down to the point where we can no longer do it, if you go back to the pension system, the decision, Heaton decision back a couple of years ago, they alluded to that. In dicta, they said the police power of the state is such that we do have that responsibility, but we cannot go to that point now because we have the ability to raise taxes. Sooner or later, that ability is going to go away. It's going to stop. We're not going to be able to pay for this. So even in dicta, the state Supreme Court has agreed that what we can do is somewhat modify these things, but it's got to be done at the federal level with regard to Article 9. It's got to start there. I think it can be done. I think it will withstand that constitutional challenge. And when doing that, we renegotiate all the benefits through negotiation with all the parties. But we've got to get ourselves off of this notion that we can do nothing about past benefits other than continue to throw money after money after money. We are one more economic disaster away from going right back down to 40, 45, 35, 20% funding on pensions. We sat in 22%, Chicago Pension Fund. We are one deep economic recession from them being completely insolvent. What are we going to do about that?
So again, Stephen Reich, previous conversation I had with him last week, a little bit more than we shared with you last week about the moral imperative. And he went on to talk about the importance of the state addressing this, because you're going to have a quarter of every dollar, if not more, go to pay for pensions. And that's going to take away from the state being able to provide a safe state for its citizens. And it's not something that's just going to go away in the short term. It has to be be taken care of. And this has been an ongoing conversation for years at the Illinois State House with the questions of unfunded pension liability and how that's going to be impacting people and taxpayers moving forward. All right, got to take a break. It is Springfield's Morning News. I'm Greg Bishop on 92.7 WMAY, Springfield's News.